I still remember the day Patricia Bramwell fainted face first into my grandfather's prized marigolds after discovering the quiet 73-year-old man she tried to harass for not joining her HOA was actually a retired federal agent with a badge that still carried weight. She had come to serve him with what she called a final compliance notice. He ended up serving her with something much more official. My grandfather, Harold Smir, had moved into his late sister's house in Maple Ridge Gardens about 6 months before the incident. The neighborhood was this weird patchwork where half the homes belonged to the HOA and half didn't because of some ancient property line dispute from the 1980s that nobody ever bothered to resolve. Grandpa Harold's house sat firmly on the non-HOA side of that invisible line. He was a widower with thick white hair and hands that still looked like they could bend steel despite his age. He spent most afternoons on his porch playing solitaire or reading old westerns. But Patricia Bramwell, who insisted everyone call her President Bramwell, even at the grocery store, had appointed herself the supreme ruler of the Maple Ridge Gardens Homeowners Association. She ran that HOA like it was her personal kingdom, and she was always looking to expand her territory. The first time she noticed Grandpa Harold, she complained about his American flag being 2 inches too large according to her measurements. Then she had issues with his bird feeder attracting too many blue jays. Then she got upset that his recycling bins were visible from the street for more than 12 hours on collection day. The real trouble started when Patricia decided that Grandpa Harold's refusal to join her HOA was somehow a personal insult to her authority. She would stand at the property line with a tape measure, documenting what she called aesthetic violations. She took photos of his lawn at 6 o'clock in the morning, claiming the grass was half an inch too tall. She printed fake violation notices on official-looking letterhead and taped them to his door. These notices cited made-up regulations like Section 12.4 regarding mailbox color conformity and Article 8 about mandatory participation in neighborhood unity initiatives. Grandpa Harold mostly ignored her with the patience of someone who had dealt with much scarier people in his career. But Patricia kept escalating her campaign. She started telling neighbors that my grandfather was probably a squatter who had broken into the house. She called the city inspector, claiming his shed was built without permits, even though it had been there since 1992. She even walked into his backyard one afternoon with a clipboard to conduct what she called a voluntary mandatory property assessment. When Grandpa Harold politely but firmly told her to get off his property, Patricia called what she referred to as the Maple Ridge Security Force. This turned out to be her 22-year-old son, Bradley, who drove around in a golf cart with a yellow strobe light duct taped to the roof. Bradley wore a vest he bought at a military surplus store and carried a walkie-talkie that wasn't connected to anything. He handed my grandfather a citation written in purple gel pen that threatened legal action for non-compliance with community standards. Grandpa Harold took the citation, read it carefully, then made a phone call while Bradley stood there trying to look official. I found out later he was calling his old colleague at the US Marshal Service to discuss some interesting patterns he had noticed in Patricia's behavior. The next morning, Patricia showed up at 7 a.m. with what she claimed was a cease and desist order from her attorney. The document, which she had clearly typed herself using a template from the internet, demanded that Grandpa Harold either join the HOA immediately or face immediate legal consequences for disrupting neighborhood harmony. She also announced, loudly enough for all the neighbors to hear, that she had called the police to report an unregistered resident with a suspicious background living outside of HOA oversight. About 20 minutes later, a county sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the house. Patricia stood on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and a smug expression, watching as the deputy got out of his car. She had her phone ready to record what she assumed would be my grandfather's humiliation. The deputy walked up to the porch where Grandpa Harold was sitting calmly in his rocking chair. That's when my grandfather stood up and pulled out his wallet. But instead of an ID, he produced a badge, a real federal badge that caught the morning sunlight. The deputy took one look at it and immediately relaxed, saying something like, "Good morning, Marshal Smir." Patricia's face went through about 6 different colors. She started screaming that this was impersonation of a federal officer and that she would have him arrested for false credentials. She actually tried to grab the badge out of his hand. The deputy had to step between them, explaining, "No, ma'am, that is definitely a real US Marshal's badge, and this man is indeed a federal law enforcement officer." The shock hit Patricia like a physical force. Her knees buckled, and she went down hard, right into Grandpa Harold's flower bed. She crushed about 6 marigolds and a decorative garden gnome on her way down. The deputy had to call for medical assistance while my grandfather just stood there shaking his head. It turned out that Grandpa Harold had spent 38 years with the US Marshal Service, specializing in financial crimes and property fraud. Even in retirement, he still worked as a consultant for federal cases. And for the past 3 months, he had been quietly documenting every single thing Patricia had done: the fake citations, the forged legal documents, the trespassing, the harassment, and, most interesting of all, her use of HOA funds. See, Patricia had been treating the HOA bank account like her personal shopping budget. She had used association dues to buy herself a new laptop, claiming it was for HOA business. She purchased a $500 camera to document violations, but used it mainly for her Instagram posts. She even bought exercise equipment and wrote it off as community wellness supplies. My grandfather had noticed discrepancies in the financial report she posted and had started investigating. The county launched a full audit within a week. HOA members who had been too intimidated to speak up before suddenly found their voices. An emergency meeting was called at the community center. Patricia tried to preside over it, but the members voted to lock her out of the session entirely. She stood outside banging on the glass doors while the treasurer revealed that over $15,000 was missing from various accounts. The climax came at what everyone now calls the Thursday Night Massacre. It was supposed to be a regular HOA meeting, but my grandfather had been invited as a special guest to present his findings. He showed up with a laptop and a portable projector. His presentation was titled, "Abuse of Authority in Residential Governance, a Case Study." He went through 18 months of Patricia's violations with the methodical precision of someone who had presented evidence in federal court. He showed receipts for personal purchases made with HOA credit cards. He had photos of Patricia trespassing on multiple properties, including his own. He presented a timeline of her harassment campaign, complete with dates and witness statements. He even had audio recordings of her making false reports to city officials, which is actually a misdemeanor in our state. Patricia tried to interrupt several times, but the other board members told her to sit down and be quiet. When she refused, they voted right then and there to remove her from her position as president, effective immediately. She tried to claim the vote was invalid because it wasn't on the official agenda, but the vice president pulled out the bylaws and showed that emergency votes were permitted in cases of financial misconduct. The room erupted in applause when the vote passed 28-2, with only Patricia and her sister voting against the motion. Patricia grabbed her purse and tried to storm out, but discovered that someone had already changed the locks on the HOA office where she had been keeping all her presidential supplies, including a gavel she bought with association funds. She completely lost it at that point. She barricaded herself in the HOA storage closet with her Yorkshire Terrier and a bottle of wine she had also purchased with HOA money. The fire department had to be called to get her out because she had somehow managed to jam the door from the inside. When they finally extracted her 3 hours later, she was served with a civil lawsuit from the HOA seeking restitution for the embezzled funds. But that wasn't the end of it. The district attorney's office decided to pursue criminal charges for the false police reports and the embezzlement. Patricia ended up having to pay back $22,000 in misappropriated funds, plus another $18,000 in legal fees. She was sentenced to 300 hours of community service and 2 years of probation. When the judge read the sentence, Patricia's jaw dropped, and she actually asked if she could do her community service as an HOA president. The judge just stared at her and said, "Absolutely not."